Warm welcome all of you again. Good evening and good morning to a lot of folks who've joined from overseas. Continuing with our momentum to have a immersive chat and a conversation with celebrity professionals and executives. I think let's continue with that momentum. Where I'd like to give a warm welcome to Punit. Punit, I think we can see you. Make sure that you unmute so we also get to hear from you. You can hear us okay?
Yeah, thank you for having.
Excellent, excellent. Punit is a role model to many around the world, especially in India. He's the co-founder and CEO of Suki. Suki is one of the hottest, AI startups out of the Silicon Valley. In fact, recently got nominated one of the best new startup for Forbes AI 50 list. They are talking about, experience as a service from Shamik Stock. Here we are continuing to spend some time with the CEO and co-founder and the brains behind Suki, an AI-powered, voice assistant for doctors. And we'll learn more about that from him in a second. Many of you may know him, may recall and may remember him as the Chief Product Officer of Flipkart while he was in Bangalore, a senior product leader with Google and Motorola. Punit has been involved in the development of several high-profile products like Google News, Google Books, Google Plus, Google Mobile, and a suite of high-performance products and Motorola devices, including Moto X, one of my favorite, Moto G and Moto E. So here we are, talking to somebody who's gonna walk the, talk the talk, walk the walk, and here we are having a fireside chat. So with that, without wasting time, Punit, here's my first fiery question, and kind of we'll see how this goes in the conversation as more and more questions kind of pour in from the audience. I strongly encourage. Punit does not have slides here today, so he's gonna free flow conversation with all of us, and so feel free to drop in your toughest question, your most curious question on your mind, and I'm sure we're gonna get a fantastic insightful answer from him. But Punit, obviously a big fan, and I think a lot of us look up to you in terms of building products in an age where each one of them has been a sensational journey for, I'm sure, for you and for the markets that you're going to serve. Now, arguably at products that you've kind of built at Google, most of them perhaps didn't have direct revenue. And I think this is a big question that keeps on coming, especially with product communities. When you don't have a product that kind of makes some direct revenue, doesn't charge the customer perhaps upfront, how do you make a business case, right? How do you evangelize internally and make a business case for something like this, which is kind of free? And I'm sure there are many other ways to make money, but from a customer perspective, and are you using something similar in Suki now that you're kind of in the healthcare space? So tell us more about that as well, but kind of help us understand this dilemma that, how do we continue to make products which are presumably appearing as free and yet very powerful, and yet how do you kind of associate success with and make a business case for them?
Well, first of all, Pinkesh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think we did something like this a couple of years ago, so it's really good to see how you guys have grown and become so successful in the intervening period. You also made me very happy when you said Moto X was your favorite phone. It's definitely one of the most something that's very close to my heart in terms of the work we have done. So now going back to your question, how do you make a business case for products that actually don't have direct business impact? I think it sort of depends upon the context we are in, to be honest. I can obviously give you a point of view from the Motorola days, and I can give you a point of view from the Google days. Now, Google product managers rarely learn how to worry about margins. It happens when you basically are building a business on top of a basement that's printing money. Having said that, the scale at which we operate is different when we were there, and then the kind of outcomes that you require to actually see if you have success or not is also different. Business case has to be clear, irrespective of the fact that you can't do a direct translation to exact cash flow as it's coming in. And in the case of Google, it used to be pretty straightforward. It used to be basically active usage. You look at, because if you remember, I mean, as you know, Google has probably the most significant, you know, whether you call it eyeballs or you call it, you know, engagement or attention monetizing machine in the world. As long as we can capture you along the flow of your attention where you're doing things, we can try and convert that into some kind of revenue. So the primary question to ask is, how do you engage and capture people's attention along the flow of doing things? Now, it depends on product to product. In certain products, for example, in search, what's actually not important, at least in the early days of search, was whether you stayed there and you were paying attention and what your engagement was in terms of the amount of time you spent. What was important was to actually give you the right answer and send you as fast as possible to the goal, to the destination. The speed at which you could find something and were sent to the place such that you didn't have to come back and look again was an indication of the quality of the product. It meant that search was working very well. So now that is a case where actually the business case was built upon a different metric, which was how quickly do you find the query that you're looking for and quickly you move off from the particular search page. If you take an example of something like YouTube, that's not the case. In YouTube, you actually are trying to keep the person there. And when they come in, what you're really trying to see is how many minutes they're spending in it, how many kinds of videos they see, what is the sequence in which these playlists are run into or automated, etc. And so it's sort of, in the case of a company that actually has an attention monetizing machine, the key business criteria then becomes a part of whatever the flow is in which you're building a product. Now, if you go to a different world and you start thinking about Motorola or a phone, in that case, it's different. You're not really trying to just bounce off and trying to figure out what metrics there are. What you're really trying to figure out is what is the utility of the products that you built, because people buying the phone is somewhat slightly disconnected from the kind of features they use in the phone after they have bought it. But if once they have bought it, they use a lot of those features, then you can actually justify investing more and trying to push more investment into the phone. And so in that case, what you're really tracking again is simple things like DAUs and weekly active usage and monthly active usage, and the fact that if you actually build a product that overlapped with something that is actually on the Play Store, then how long do you use this versus that? And we do have those kind of metrics and instrumentations to be able to do that. So again, unclear if I directly answered your question. It is really hard to answer a question around how do you impact the revenue of Google in a direct way, but attention monetization is something that Google knows very well, and so you have to create attention, and everything else can happen over time.
You know, while there are a lot of interesting metrics that one can measure, one should measure, and depends on the kind of business. If I can go a little deeper in the question itself, that, you know, at some point, were you ever asked to quantify? And maybe Google is a different story. I like the way you know, if you have a basement that's kind of printing machine, perhaps it's not as important, but not every company, in fact, most others around the world may not have a basement that's printing machine, printing money. And so even then, there are a lot of attempts that have been made, and many successful ones, where a product was built where there was no direct, you know, consumer revenue, and perhaps data, coming back to the theme for today, perhaps that data itself was of value. And now the question is, how do you quantify in the minds of the investor, in the minds of the management team who wants to fund this? Because if you don't associate some value, at some point this becomes a hobby project and probably will not survive too long. So I'm sure there must be some. Have you ever encountered?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Sorry, I'll let you finish before I'll respond.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Yes, that actually makes sense, and um, it sort of depends upon the problem statement you're solving. So, for example, imagine that you are going to build a AI-based digital assistant for doctors. It seems like at least somebody here is doing it. We have, I have to show that this particular product that I'm building is going to generate some value for the user, which will actually lead to some kind of business case, right? Now, there are many different ways to actually attack this. The first question you have to ask yourself whenever you start building a product is what problem you're solving. It has to be, and the framework I really typically like to use is what is a powerful constituency that has a huge burnout issue, the solution of which aligns with the incoming tech trend. So you start there, right? Because ultimately, if you can't actually articulate that, trying to figure out what data comes to validate that doesn't make sense. And so a classic example is Salesforce. Powerful constituency is salespeople. The burnout was mostly their managers, and they were burning out because of lack of CRM. The trend was, the transition to cloud from on-prem software. Benioff built cloud CRM. Salespeople adopted hand over fist. Lots of data flows to the system. They used that data to start creating Force.com, ERP systems, all the other things, and suddenly you have a great enterprise company. So now the starting point to being able to figure out what metrics you want to actually measure, how do you want to assess the business cases, to ask yourself what's a powerful constituency. In the case of Suki, the powerful constituency that had a big problem that was burning out was doctors. Okay. Why were they burning out? They're burning out because they're using 90s style EMRs, and they're using all these clunky machines, and then they're burdened with all these regulatory burdens and liability and billing and coding and things like that. And then what's the trend? The trend that's incoming is basically that voice is becoming commoditized. Okay, now you have a story. Now the question you have to ask yourself is this a valid business case? Yes, I have actually identified an equation. What's the valid business case? So the starting, there are many different ways to do it. One way to do it is to say, if they're burning out, there must be other solutions in the market. What is the total amount of money being spent on all these solutions? One could argue that there's dictation software, there is transcription services where people in India type into EMRs for people, doctors in the US, there is, scribes, human beings who sit next to the person, and then 50% of doctors type. So therefore, there is their value of time. And then there is also like the value of the time of the LPs, nurses, etc. You can take labor markets, you can take 10Ks, you can take ARR, projections for various companies and pull together what is the spend that's actually happening to solve this problem in the market. That's one way, right? One could argue that that's $10 to $20 billion. And in my opinion, when you're validating a business case, after you go beyond a couple of $1 billion, it doesn't matter that much, but it's a big number. That's one way. The other way to look at it is to say, what is the per month average spend that these doctors are doing, depending upon who you talk to, on things that they're investing in. That's another way to look at it. Another way to look at it is the actual time. For example, for 1 hour of clinical work, a doctor does 1 hour of administrative work. Okay, if you can save them that 1 hour of administrative work consistently, then you end up getting 5 hours of doctor time back in a week. Hypothetically, if they saw only one more patient a day, they could more than pay for any product that saves them the rest of the 4 hours. So suddenly you're quantifying it based on that. And then finally, another way to quantify it is to actually start looking at logs and instrumentation of existing EMRs, and which, by the way, large health systems track acutely to see how much time does it take to do a particular task. And so in a classic example is, this may be a surprise to people, but in US, if you're trying to give somebody a flu shot, it takes typically about 23 clicks across various things to actually get to a place where you have approved or prescribed that flu shot to a person. Now, why would it take 23 clicks? it turns out that you're basically selecting something. There's a drop down, then you choose something, then you have to put a dosage, then you have to change the dosage, then you have to assign it to the person, then you have to go. On the flip side, you could have just said, hey, prescribe a flu shot. So these are different ways to use, to create business cases. Sometimes you use market analysis, sometimes you use time analysis, sometimes you use actual per month, spend analyses, and there are many different ways in which you can figure this out.
Do you think that, the business case and the genre of business cases that we're seeing now have changed or have become easy or difficult because of this whole infusion of the third element of your equation, which is the trend, right? And the trend being, leveraging data science, leveraging ML, AI, in your case, voice at Suki. Do you think that has an impact on developing a different genre of business cases, or do you think the business case is just the business case? This is just an accelerator. What's your view?
I think it's a trend. There is always, at regular intervals, a hype cycle, and then it kind of becomes real. I think now we're going to be very real for some time. I think that what happens is, and this has happened at regular intervals since at least 2000, is that there is a time and a phase where suddenly typically a social wave kicks off. Every 6 to 8 years, a whole new set of social networking like things start popping up. Basically, people figure out how to interact with each other differently. There was obviously the super early Friendster and all of the things that happened around that time. Then basically there came these, one but slightly larger group kind of interaction models, which were mostly Facebooks and things like that. Then you actually had the messaging apps that popped up, and then the messaging app content became smaller, and now you have, messaging mixed in with content creation, which is kind of like TikTok stuff happening. And then I'm pretty sure that there will be another one that will kick off in a few years. Depending on where you are, they use different signals. And depending on the signals that they use, typically what happens is that a whole new set of products can be built. If you're in the middle of that hype cycle, then typically an investment model will involve just, hey, can you grab as much attention as possible? We will figure out the rest. And you've seen this, when we were in I think it was a 7-8 time frame when there was actually another recession going on in US at that point in time, but there was this whole, what is it called? Basically mobile, local, you're trying to figure out how to actually use all of that. And that's when, I think Fourspace and a bunch of other companies kicked off around that time, which used location to actually figure out things. My point is that, that when you're in the middle of this hype cycle, and it has to kind of overlap with the economy being reasonably well, people's attention to actual metrics, real practical metrics becomes a lot less. There is a lot more conversation about, just go and get as many users as possible and we'll figure out what to do with it. When you are not in the middle of it, people's attention to more practical business metrics becomes much more clearer. In general, where it comes to consumer stuff, if anybody here before or after is going to tell you that there is a craft that allows you to, an equation you can solve that will create a consumer product that's successful, they're basically bullshitting you. Okay, there are certain things you can do to keep, to not mess up. But beyond that, there is a point of you're in trend with something, something might actually connect with people. What typically people are doing with building consumer products is not that they are nailing every aspect of it upfront. They're actually somewhere in the vicinity throwing darts, and then they look at the user feedback, and the company that actually knows how to agile and be tweak and just move it very quickly are the ones that build great consumer products. And so in summary, I do believe this is a time that actually people are going to be much more practical about business metrics. This actually also means a lot of businesses that actually have clearer, direct monetization goals, direct, translatable margins and translatable business goals are the ones that will be funded a lot more. Consumer companies are iterative companies which should not take too much money and should basically, you're just testing things like engagement and retention and attention and all of these things, and then figuring out how to keep building over the next 2-3 years.
Interesting. I'm going to switch to some of these questions which have started pouring in. I think Shibanda Roy has a question on, how do we use data in that process of creating that value proposition design that you very eloquently described? What are the different phases of the developing of that business, the product business in particular, that you actually use different elements of data, while the pain of the customer is obviously paramount, like you said, and this is very traditional, product management. We go back to the value proposition design, look at how big is the pain, look at the alternatives, look at what else is happening, or why others are not serving it, right? But now bringing the data element of it, is this changing the way, either in speed or in process or in steps, how you would frame the next big feature, the next big product, the next big idea? And a related question, from Sundar, is, in some sense, what is the most popular from your experiences, having dealt with a lot of data-driven products? What has been the most popular use, of data science? In fact, Rishi probably should get an award, because that's one of the polls that also the team had thought of. And so while the question is to you is to kind of answer, what are the popular uses of data science that you've seen, either in the process, the steps, the speed of which creating this, or the different parts of the cycle, whether it's decision making, whether it's data as a feature, whether it's dynamic pricing, and so on and so forth. But before you answer, let's kind of put up that poll also for the audience, in parallel, for the audience to vote on as well. And then I'll turn it over to Punit. Can we have the poll, please? Super. So while the poll progresses, Punit, what are your thoughts? How is data impacting, our traditional world of coming up with that process that you just mentioned for developing good value proposition design?
I think the most interesting thing that's happening in the market today is the practical usage of things like machine learning in product development. Machine learning, especially like broadly spoken, is almost like a buzzword. Everybody wants to include some machine learning in the slides that they put up to try to raise money. Even a dog walking app in Silicon Valley uses some kind of machine learning. But in reality, what we are seeing, Pinkesh, is that now the models that actually are underlying some of these systems have become robust enough that you can actually create very quick impact on user experience using this data that's coming out of it. So I'll give you an example. We are building a voice product. A voice product, just like an Alexa or a Siri or a Google Assistant, is basically a command and control product. So you say things to it and it'll do things for you. These things that you say are converted into things that we call intents. Intents, when they actually flow through the system, because of the nature of how humans talk, the breadth in which they can say the same idea, background noise, all sorts of other device complications, sometimes intents can break. So, imagine there's an intent which says, what's the schedule today for the doctor? And the doctor says, what's my schedule like? Another doctor says, what's my day like? Another doctor says, how does today look for me? These are all basically intents. Let's say that you have many doctors using the product Suki, and they're all kind of asking in different ways, what's my day looking like? And some of those intents will break. Typically, when an intent breaks, you're using your Alexa and you say something to it, then what do you do typically? If it doesn't understand you, you say it again. And you say it in a slightly more structured way so it actually gets it. Now you have two pieces of data that you created out of it, right? One, you basically got data around intents that don't work and the associated audio that actually you need. And then second, you got data around what was the follow-up question that actually, or the follow-up intent. And you can almost always tag it together and say that basically this broken intent solution was this next intent that was actually triggered. Now, imagine getting those data points at thousands and thousands of those for a particular intent. What we do typically behind the scenes is we will take a lot of that information and actually use humans to clean it. Okay, data, if used basically directly into a model, first of all, is prone to biases, bad signals. It can look right, but actually could be really wrong, and more importantly, it could cause actually real significant product failures later on. And so we clean it, and then you automatically push it into the system, and the consequences that within a very short period of time, almost every way in which you can ask the doctor what, or the doctor asks Suki what my day looks like or what my schedule looks like, is captured. So it's a classic example, a very simple example, but a very, very measurable example for us, Pinkesh, where I have, in a matter of a few months of launching Suki, been able to collect almost every variation of the 20 to 30 workflows that a doctor does again and again repeatably, and being able to create a model around that in such a way that we now have pretty much the foremost intent recognizer in the market. Now, there would be many, many other ways people would have done that, but the classic, the fact that we could actually build a machine learning based intent recognizer that actually coupled with a continuous inflow of data that comes in from the users, combined with a cleaning system that actually cleaned it, tracked it, make sure the accuracy was high, leads to such that things that would take people years in previous iterations of product takes us months now to actually get done. Absolutely. So it's an example of how you can use data. Now, this problem I'm solving hypothetically is an enterprise problem, but the problem that I was describing to you is a consumer problem. So this blur is
absolutely
just,
yeah. It can be applied to any of the two contexts, is what you're saying, and
it can be, and anybody who thinks that enterprise businesses or enterprise structures need completely different ways of looking at data is wrong, because they're the same. It's consumerization of enterprise.
Yeah, and what problems are they solving? In fact, the poll results very interestingly kind of confirm what you're saying as well. The sentiment, at least, is, hey, look, 57% are saying that the most popular data science usage that they've seen is around data-driven features. Kind of similar to what you were saying. Because of the technology, because of the data science, we're able to kind of tag that intent and kind of build a better, clear picture for doctors. The second highest voted was 55%, because it was a multiple choice question, so they could choose multiple options, was data science for decision science. And this is about making better decisions about your products, perhaps your segments,
or strategy,
right? Or your strategy. Do you use much of that?
Yeah.
Did you leverage? I mean, before you said, look, I want to go solve this $10 billion problem in healthcare. Were there, other than reading Gartner reports or whatever other secondary research you may have seen, did you actually deploy a lot of data science in your early stages of MVP to even confirm whether this is the right problem to solve?
I think that, look, as a consumer-focused product person, a large swath of my energy obviously goes in using data to actually drive feature work, right? At least in the iteration where I was not the CEO of this company. Now, that changed dramatically when you actually go to places like Motorola and Flipkart. How do you decide where to put fulfillment centers? How do you decide, how do you route different kinds of goods to different areas depending upon what kind of demand? How do you decide basically that certain things, for example, if you have a very large number of textile oriented things coming from Surat, I'm just making up something, then how do you actually figure out, how do you route that to the rest of the country? What is the decisions you're going to take in terms of a combination of third party delivery versus your own delivery? such that a really nice antique that's made in Kashmir can actually get to Kanyakumari in 48 hours. You know, there are a lot of these decisions that have to be made that actually involve 5 to 10 year long time horizons over time, right? And they cannot be made without, they cannot be made in vacuum. They have to have data. We had a very rigorous data science team at Flipkart. It spent a lot of time churning away and chomping away at a lot of this data and trying to come up with basically answers to our questions. It did get to a place where we could just literally say, here are the questions we're trying to solve, and they would actually go and figure out the science behind it. And so if I ended up actually just spending time figuring out how to drive features using data, we would end up actually making seriously bad decisions for business, because a lot of that data actually tells us where these features should be deployed, how they should be deployed, what kind of ancillary services you need to actually do those kind of things. And so to me, the audience is mostly right. Those are the two areas that you actually have to spend a lot of time in. And the stakes are pretty high, especially when you're talking about companies that have huge fixed costs and capital investments. A pure SaaS company like Suki can afford to be much more agile in terms of its deployments, because it's just software. I'm moving bits around. And yes, whether I focus on a particular segment or the other can fundamentally alter my business, but it's not the same thing as me spending $10 million here versus there on a network of fulfillment centers that might actually come online in 48 months in such a way that if I didn't do that, then I'll not catch up to Amazon or anybody else I'm fighting. Absolutely. So these are very critical decisions that are taken, and without data science, you're just flying blind.
Switching from this into a good segue, which is, leveraging data science is, I think, key. What you're also saying is applying data science in the traditional product sense of kind of solving the right problem is also important. And maybe tying it back to a few questions that I'm seeing popping up, like, for example, Satish Simhachalan is asking this question on what are the top 3 skills required by a data science product manager or a data product manager. Adding to that, I think Gopal is asking something very similar. How deep does a product professional, in your opinion, your advice, how deep should they go, in the data space? We can talk about, orientation level, application level, algorithm level. What is your advice? Is the Gopal's question. So maybe you can answer both, and then can I have some more follow-ups?
Yeah, no question. Here's the way I look at it. I think first of all, as a product leader, you go as deep as you can so that you have direct access and comfort that you actually have the right answers that you need for the question you're asking. And so from my perspective, if I'm going to be, let's say, an ML product manager today, then it does not suffice to actually sit there and say, I want to build this feature, and somebody's going to build an ML black box and put it all together. I need to understand what kind of data is required. I need to understand how do you acquire that data. I need to understand how do you clean that data. I need to understand what happens when you put that data into these models, and what is going to be spit out of it. I need to understand the quantity of data that's required to actually do these things. These are the kind of things that really, really world-class data scientists do day in, day out. Now, can I actually suddenly take on the role of a data scientist or be able to actually be in their position and do everything they've done? It's pretty hard. I would say there's experience and learning and things that they've done, but could go a long way, in being able to make the dent. I think partnering with really good engineering leaders who actually have spent time doing data engineering is useful. Partnering with, obviously, if you have data scientists in your crew, then working very closely with them is very useful. If you have the ability to even model some of these yourselves using some simple scripts, that is a great idea. And so how deep do you go? You go as deep as you can so that you can get the work done. I do believe anybody who's going to have a hands-off approach to this thing is looking for it's a little bit of a recipe for a disaster, regardless of what talent you have. If you are going to be the head of product of a company that's going to use data, then at least understand where the data comes from, what quantity of data you need, is it clean or not, and what does it take to actually put it together, and what's the quality of that data. You need to know the answers to these questions at the bare minimum. Beyond that, I think you go all the way to actually being a very rudimentary data scientist also yourself if you have to do that. So that's the way I look at it. When I hire people who actually have to work a lot with data, typically I'm looking for these attributes. I would ask them a question and I would basically try to see if they can actually break it down into where do you get the data from, how do you clean it, what quantity of data you need, and what happens when you actually put it into traditional models. A data product manager needs to be able to answer those questions always.
Very nice. When we asked this question in the community a few months ago, we got about 6 distinct, response vectors on what they felt was the most important career accelerator for a data product manager. In fact, the team has created a poll. Can you put that poll up for the community? And while that poll comes up and everybody's taking that, I think the follow-on question for you, Punit, and see if you agree with, first of all, what the sentiments of the group here today through the poll. But before that, do you think in a data science-driven startup, and you've in fact answered a question that I had written down that somebody was asking also on the group, which is, would you hire a product manager in a data science startup like Suki who's not, formally trained or at least understanding the elements of data? I think you already answered that. But do you think data is eventually going to become a horizontal infused skill in every part of the org? Or do you still feel that there is always going to be this kind of separate, data team, or is it going to be both? How are you
Wonderful
structuring it right now at Suki, and how do you see other companies, and what would be your advice for those who are just starting out, to kind of to structure the org, which path seems to be the best working for you in your experience?
Yeah, wonderful question. I think there are multiple questions here. So let's, first of all, do you think of data as a horizontal, or it should be basically something that actually is a function that actually supports everybody else? It sort of depends upon the scale and the size of your company to some extent. These are not exclusive situations. Okay. In my opinion, regardless of whatever stage of the company you're at, data and data-driven decision-making has to be it has to be basically a platform on which you sit. Okay. Data-driven feature work can be something that product people do. Data-driven decision-making, every single part of the company has to do. Okay. And what does that mean? It means that if you're an operations person, you better not be making decisions on how to actually decide to throw people at a problem without actually understanding what happens when a little bit more usage comes in, and what is the incremental usage, what is the weekly cadence, how do you project these things out? If you are going to be a salesperson, then you better not be actually figuring out where to put your investments without actually doing some amount of analysis on what kind of campaigns and what kind of things actually trigger what kind of demand in certain areas. Obviously, product is the same, design is the same. There is no, if there is any part of the company, HR, culture, if there's any part of the company that says that they can make a decision without data, then I will be very troubled, because there is a pretty good chance that they are going to be biased by their, instincts, which may be right sometimes, but could actually be very bad or disastrous at other places. So that's one point. The second point is that, if it's a company of tremendous scale with unbelievable amounts of investments to be made, having a dedicated data science team in addition to a platform that people can use to make decisions, both make sense. Flipkart had that, Moto had that. There is obviously swaths of Google where we have that, used to have that too. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And then I think what is the third question, Pinkesh? I think there was another attribute you had actually.
So when organizations are kind of starting out, right?
Yes, yes,
What
yes,
would you recommend? Because it may be a luxury to kind of have a dedicated data science
yeah,
team.
yeah,
At the same time, it's a very risky thing to have kind of Neem Hakim, right? Somebody who knows little
yeah,
bit of data and still makes, so what do you
yeah.
recommend?
Yeah, I agree. So when you're starting out, you have no option. Okay. Anybody who actually starts out and says they're going to build a data science team, I will not trust my money with, because I actually think they don't have, they are building too much. They're overbuilding the company without actually having proven something. This doesn't mean data science is not required. It means that if you actually are going to hire, you know, a product manager, a data science person, a designer, an engineer, and you want to start a company, then I'll be very worried, because at the early days of the company, you are the one who is all of those things. And so the way I look at it is, for companies that are starting, especially companies that I would invest in, I want to see the founder actually have enough information and knowledge. It doesn't matter if they don't have the frameworks or the tray or the classic, styles and things that data scientists do, but I want to see them do whatever they can with whatever information they have at disposal to make data driven decisions. And I do not think a company at a very, very early stage can afford to invest in a specific data science team. It can invest in a person who actually may have some data science capabilities in addition to other things. It can invest in themselves by educating themselves in how to actually manage these things. But ultimately, on the other side of things, any decision that this startup makes without any data and just based on instinct is fraught with significant danger too. And so therefore, when somebody comes to me and says, I'm making a decision, this is it. I'm not asking them if they have a data science team. I'm asking them, give me what data you use to make this decision and show me how that data is clean and not biased based on your point of view and things you want to do.
Excellent. Well, this is wonderful. I think time flies by when you're having an amazing conversation that's so immersive and insightful. But I think that is just about all the time we had. I know there are at least 16 more questions that I see on this window, and I'm sure numerous others on the LinkedIn thread. So I'd certainly request Punit if you also can take a quick glance at some of
Sure.
those questions on the link offline and kind of answer. But as always, it's always a pleasure to interact, to learn, to get inspired by what you've done and what you're doing now, and wish you all the very best with the new venture. I'm sure it's going to do wonders as it already has. So thanks for joining. I know in a busy schedule like yours, it's hard, but all the way from California, guys, give a big round of applause virtually to Puneet, and thanks for doing
Hey,
this.
Pinkesh, I want to say that in these times of pandemic and other things, I think it takes a lot of effort for groups like you and folks like you to actually create a platform where a lot of people can interact with each other. Um, it's not easy what you do and what your team has done. And I want to congratulate you and thank you for that. I think a lot of people benefit from the work you guys put in. It makes the world a better place. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's all for the ecosystem. All back to you, Sai.
Thank you so much, Puneet. Really appreciate the wonderful conversation and also the wishes.